Welcome. I'm Vince Poscente, and today we're going to talk about what has become a political hot potato, cancel culture. And what exactly is cancel culture? Some say it's a call for accountability. Others see it as a form of punishment or censorship. Is it helping our society evolve, or is it polarizing us? Or is there some common ground we can learn from? To answer these questions, both our guests are award-winning journalists. Ernest Owens is the recipient of the Changemakers Award. He's also the author of an upcoming book, The Case for Cancel Culture. And Jonathan Rauch, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and proponent of free speech. He's the author of The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. John, let's start with you. Now, some of the latest polls from Pew Research found that 55% of Americans hold back from fear of retaliation, and 84% surveyed feel it's a problem they cannot speak freely. Now, why has cancel culture become such a political hotbed?
Well, the polls that you just mentioned, Vince, are exactly the reason, and those are on the low side. Most polls are finding that 60% to two-thirds of Americans are reluctant to give their true political opinions for fear of basically being canceled, some form of very negative social consequence. Now, cancel culture, it's not the same as criticism. It's not me saying, Ernest, Vince, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. It's a different kind of discourse. It's about organized campaigns to silence, intimidate, punish, and fire people that you disagree with. And that is a very different kind of activity.
Now, Ernest, what's your perspective? What's the definition of cancel culture?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Vince, and I'm happy to be on this show. I think that cancel culture really is something about people looking for accountability in institutions and places that they believe cause a detriment to their livelihood. I don't see it being a right-wing issue. I don't see it being a left-wing issue. I believe that it's a tool for accountability. And with all tools, there will be bad actors. And there will be good actors and people who are operating in good faith. And so I think that we should look at this as a tool rather than a certain trend, because before it was cancel culture, it was PC culture, another call out culture and everything else in between. But really, this is about people speaking out against things that can cause a detriment to their livelihood.
It really has been around for generations. John, what's your perspective?
Well, you're both right that it's been around for a long time. Alexis de Tocqueville, greatest American observer, came to the United States from France in the 1830s and said that the greatest threat to liberty in America was not from the government. It was from what he called the tyranny of majority opinion, which is the ability of some people to use social pressure to silence people from dissenting. John Stuart Mill said the same thing about Britain in 1859, that the biggest threat to freedom was not from the government. It was from people who were imposing conformity of viewpoint. So there's nothing new here, but we've got a new kind of problem in the United States because the advent of social media and the rise of new forms of activism have allowed people to weaponize social coercion in a way that we hadn't seen before.
John, is there a difference between canceling someone and criticizing them?
All the difference in the world. Now, sometimes in a particular case, it may be hard to tell the difference. But the breakthrough of the scientific revolution, what I call the Constitution of Knowledge, in my book of that name, forgive the advertisement, is we punish the ideas instead of the person. You make a mistake, I make a mistake, we get to keep going. We're allowed to be wrong. That breaks down when you switch from criticism, which is about saying your idea is wrong, but okay, try again with a better idea, to cancel culture, which says, you know what? You're an evil human being. You get fired. You lose your livelihood, your reputation. You go on Google or Twitter. You're tarred as a racist, maybe because of one thing that you said, and maybe was misunderstood, or maybe because of no reason at all. That is the opposite of criticism. That is about shrinking the space for having common discourse and looking for truth, not expanding that space.
Now, Ernest, your perspective on this, canceling and criticizing them, what's the difference here?
I think there's a lot of problems with those assertments. I think for starters, what we have to recognize is that we reduce and also ignore the role that there are bad faith actors in this society. There are evil people in this society. There are people who will use, weaponize free speech to promote hate speech. There are people who do things in ill will. And I think one thing that is ignored when we talk about this Constitution and when we talk about free speech is that we didn't all start at the same beginning. We did not all start with the same, unalienable rights. Society has diversified and evolved. And as societies began to diversify and expand rights for women, for people of color, for LGBTQI individuals, so were their ability to have a stake in the conversation. And so the reason why we're seeing this conversation around cancel culture expand is because as more underrepresented, marginalized people have access to being able to speak against majority opinions, they're getting that pushback from those who've had the privilege, who've had the power for so long. And so I see this as a power struggle, with those who have more privilege being more scared that they're going to now have to hear from people that they never had to hear from before. And so I think that, to your point, people having disagreements is one thing, but when we're having disagreements about people having the right to exist, we're having conversations about people having the right to, be able to be safe, to know that they're included. Those are not mere disagreements. That is the difference between life and death, and a person being able to get their rights. And I think when we reduce cancel culture to a debate about opinions rather than actual people's lived experiences, we are being intellectually dishonest about the real harms that lead to people wanting to cancel.
Right. Well, Jordan Peterson calls it reputation savaging, I believe is the term. But let's change gears here a little bit. Now, John, do you consider cancel culture to be a restriction of the First Amendment?
It's a restriction of the spirit of the First Amendment. And by that, I mean the First Amendment is a part of the Constitution, and it limits the extent to which the United States government and the states can regulate what people say. It imposes some very strict boundaries on that. It does not limit what I say to you or Ernest in this conversation. That's a private matter. But there's also the spirit of the First Amendment, and that's what it's based on. And that's the idea that everyone, including minorities, including historically and currently marginalized minorities, of which I think I'm three, minorities and everyone else are better off in a society that has free and open discourse, where people can speak their minds, where they can see each other's disagreements, true intellectual pluralism, which often, exposes us to ideas that we think are wrongheaded and harmful and need to be corrected. But that's part of freedom. That's part of living in a healthy society. So the freedom, the spirit of the First Amendment says, even if what you're saying might be constitutionally protected from the government, we should still try to live in a society where people feel that they're free to speak their minds, where they can live according to their consciences. That's what freed gay people like me to get married, as I now am. A 20-year process of saying things that a lot of people found horrible and hateful and obnoxious. But guess what? We were right. We prevailed.
Okay, Ernest, your turn. So how do we know what's acceptable in a conversation? Because if you're a person of character, we're all human. Don't we make mistakes?
I think so, but I think we have to stop pretending that racism and the actions of a lot of people are mistakes. I don't think what Kanye West did over the past several weeks was a mistake. I don't think that a lot of the rhetoric from Donald Trump was a mistake. These people are not apologizing for what they're doing. They're continuing to do it because they have the power, the resources, and access to. I think the sad part is that most of the conversations around, protecting free speech ignores the afflicted, ignores that words carry power, that words impact people, words inspire policy. And when we act as though that there are just people just saying an opinion, then again, we reduce the real responsibility that we all have. We know the line in the code of conducts that we agree to as employees. Everyday people have a code of conduct that they agree to when they work at jobs. When we violate those agreements, then that is when we put ourselves in liability. And in a society where there's a lot of powerful people that do not subscribe to those ethical codes, then everyday people have the right to practice their First Amendment speech to push back against those ideals when, the laws and government don't. If we were to just simply respect things as is in the status quo, a lot of us would be in the same predicaments as our ancestors and those before us. So I really want to push back on this idea that simply people are making mistakes and just finally getting in trouble. There are outliers. There are people
Mistakes
that do
are
this
being
to
made
themselves.
out there, right?
There are mistakes, but when we talk about the bigger examples institutionally, right? We act as though that is in the same wheelhouse, and we talk more about mistakes than actual deliberate actions. I believe there are more deliberate people doing the things they're doing that's leading to them being counseled than a bunch of people making simple mistakes. Is a racial slur really a simple mistake? Is someone being sexist really a simple mistake? Is the Me Too movement going after people and it's just a mistake? We're really victim blaming when we go into that route. There are a few, there are outliers. There's always going to be a couple of bad faith acts. But what we shouldn't do is let that summarize what is really happening in society right now.
So, John, let's step back and look at what causes someone to be canceled. What are they saying that causes this action? I mean, and also what platforms?
Anything and everything, Vince.
Everything.
It's unpredictable. This is something that I disagree with Ernest about. I think he's just factually wrong. Most cases of canceling are not evil people saying outrageous things. They're ordinary people who get in trouble with organized mobs, but typically small numbers of hyped up activists who jump on them in order to silence the rest of us. So, that's everything from the yoga studio that had to close. I interviewed the owner of a coffee shop chain of 4 stores in Portland, Oregon that closed when they were attacked by one of these cancellation crowds. David Shore, a Democratic policy analyst, was fired after some people decided to call him out for tweeting out an accurate summary of a perfectly non-racist report written by an African American. I could go on and on. The reason 2/3 of Americans are afraid to speak their mind is not that a few powerful people are not being held to account. It's that small minorities of activists with extreme points of view are jumping on them in social media, and they're afraid of that. So that's what we're actually dealing with here. And I realize Ernest and I see that differently, but I think people who look at it will find that the facts are on my side.
Well, there's also the case of Emmanuel Cafferty, right? The utility worker in San Diego.
Yes.
I mean, he held his hand out the window. He was just playing with his fingertips, but he had made some form of gesture that is associated with white supremacists. So that's a mistake by the attackers, quite frankly.
Well, and in that
What's the
particular
solution?
case, the man who called him out online, which created the mob that got Cafferty fired, subsequently said, I was wrong. That shouldn't have happened, but it didn't matter. Emmanuel Cafferty
It's
was
too
fired
late.
the next day because his employer thought, well, this guy's too controversial. That shouldn't be happening.
Right. And what's interesting is that what's hilarious and problematic here is that we're talking about these in situations where it is minorities and underrepresented people that are seeking cancellation, but we're not talking about those who are privileged that do hold the other opposite end that suppresses people who are not making mistakes, but actually people who are actually innocent. We're not talking about the book bans that are happening to Black queer writers out here by the far right or conservatives with power that are seeking to intentionally go after these journalists. But these are the same people that will use cancel culture and campaign on it, but they're the ones that are actually stopping people based on it. And those people who are pushing back and resisting against those bad actors, we're not having the conversation of what happens to underrepresented groups. We're often looking at people in positions of privilege, whether they're white, straight men, whether they're individuals who carry wealth, whether they're just people who we can, again, pick at these anecdotes, but we're not looking at the council culture that has happened largely for good. We're not talking about Me Too. We're not talking about Black Lives Matter. We're not talking about all of these different individual activist groups that have actually not just activist groups, but everyday people who signed petitions, who donated to those campaigns. You act like it's just these small little mobs that are just doing this without any real results and that they're isolated. But those are actually teachers, parents, children, teenagers, youth that are looking and wanting and demand a better society for themselves. And they've achieved results that have made people think twice before they do inappropriate things or act up. And I think that we treat free speech as just simply saying and doing whatever we want when it offends marginalized people. But what about those who are actually using this influence to use that they're for free speech, but they're consistently being hypocrites. I think everyone's a hypocrite on this conversation around cancel culture. We all want certain things not to be in place. I think it would be ridiculous to give Kanye a platform right now while he says anti-Semitic things. Do you think that Kanye West should be given a platform right now to consistently say
Yep.
anti-Semitic things? Do you think his free speech is being challenged right now as a
Ernest.
billionaire?
Ernest, this cancel culture is gaining momentum in the public conversation. And John, I'd like to switch over to you here. Where are we headed with universities and society in general?
I think we may be past peak cancellation. I'm not sure of that yet, but I think a lot more people have tumbled to the fact that in the name of protecting minorities from harm, a lot of repression has gone on, and that's actually not helpful for minorities. I think people have realized that one of the forces that's empowered MAGA and Donald Trump and those forces of white reaction has been the sense of a lot of Americans that they can't speak out freely. I think more and more universities are starting to adopt the so-called Chicago principles, which say, this is a place for robust conversation of ideas. I agree with Ernest, there are limits. We just disagree about where they are. You can't threaten people. You can't intimidate people. Of course, you can't commit fraud. There are many limitations on protected speech. But views on politics, even if they're controversial, even if they seem hurtful, that's what we're here to discuss. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're starting to see a rebound from the excesses of cancel culture. But ask me again in 5 years.
Let's dissect this a little bit. Cancel culture, can hurt minorities and the marginalized groups it claims to help. What's happening in this situation, Ernest?
I don't think so. I think that if we concede to that notion, then we didn't believe that those who are playing victims to cancel culture actually had the bad faith intent, because it shouldn't backlash if we're talking about civil discourse. Look, let's be clear. Before my ancestors and my grandparents had the free speech rights, there was a group of people in this society that said that they couldn't speak, that they couldn't vote, that they didn't have those rights. And now that I am the descendant of those individuals who are now free, and I have the right to call out these individuals for some of the same hate that their descendants continue to, pursue. Now I'm looked at as the villain here, right? Now I'm looked at as trying to cancel them. But wasn't they trying to cancel? Wasn't this how we got to civil rights? Wasn't, people would say that it was cancel culture when Black and brown people were boycotting and protesting Jim Crow rules and laws in the South. They would have called that cancel culture back then. And in spite of that, those individuals knew what it meant to have rights and to push back against hate and not tolerate that kind of stuff in the press. So I believe that actually, because of the protests that we're seeing, because of people, speaking out, the impact of George Floyd, we are seeing more people think twice about what they're doing. And that's why cancellations may not be happening maybe as much in certain situations, because people are starting to wake up and realize, let me think twice before I say something that might offend others. We're upset about these polls. I think it's a good thing. I think people should be rethinking how they just say things, because we're in a diverse society and we should be more mindful about what we say to other people. We shouldn't just go around saying whatever and not considering people's feelings. As a Black person, I can't just walk around and say whatever comes to my mind about every issue, because we've seen what has happened with the Kyrie Irvings of the world and others. I mean, do you think that cancellation was necessary, John? I think it was. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that he should have just said whatever he wanted and shared that video without any type of questions or consequences? I mean, we shouldn't let people just be out here just promoting racist ideas and anti-Semitic ideas. I think that we as a society are better than that. And I think that cancellations are beginning to be reevaluated because people are starting to act better, know better, and think twice.
John, over to you.
Well, there's a lot there. I think, unfortunately, it's a fundamentally misconceived account of how minorities like us won our rights. I was born in a country, I'm a 62-year-old American homosexual. I was born in a country where it was illegal for me to have a government job, where people like me were routinely fired if we spoke out. So we didn't. We were considered psychiatrically ill, mentally ill. We were denounced from all the pulpits. Of course, we couldn't marry. We could be arrested in our homes for simple intimacy. I could go on and on. Now, we didn't have votes. We didn't have money. We were a pariah class. What we had was our voices. And through history, through all of human history, the most potent weapon for social justice for minorities has been freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And that always begins by saying things that people in power believe are hurtful. And we need to be able to say those things, even though they're going to say all the things that Ernest is saying about people he disagrees with. They're evil, they're hurtful, they shouldn't be allowed to speak. And by the way, guess what? We're going to decide who gets to speak. Don't take my word for it. Frederick Douglass said, if true free speech prevailed in the South, every shackle of slavery would be broken within 5 years. John Lewis said, without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. Free speech is the guardian of the dissident, the minority, the oppressed. That's always been true. It will continue to be true. And that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate in saying it's tragic if minority communities like mine, who are oppressed from speaking out by dire social consequences, then turn around and try to co-opt for ourselves the very same powers to oppress others.
Well, we're in the home stretch here, so obviously we could speak for, 3-5 hours about this. But first, Ernest, what do we do about this? What kinds of actions or perspectives can we take on the topic of cancel culture?
Again, he has not answered my question on Kanye West and Kyrie Irving. As a Black person, it's upon me to say that I do not think that individuals that are like Kyrie Irving or Kanye West, who have these free speech platforms that are saying anti-Semitic things and anti-Black things, should be given platforms. And I don't think that their intentions are the same intentions of people like Sylvia and Marsha P. Johnson and others who fought during Stonewall for it. They're not the same. We're in a society that we have to acknowledge that everyone is not coming into this with good intentions. And we have seen in history with people like Hitler and other neo-Nazis that they are not on the same free speech panel that you and I and other activists were on. We have to create a line. And I think that council culture allows people to be empowered to draw that line, to acknowledge who's a bad faith actor in this free speech movement, because everyone's not coming with the same intentions. I don't believe that Kanye West is saying the things he's saying to liberate people, to fight for rights, to fight for justice. As a Black man, as a Black queer man, I know that he does not represent my community. He does not represent the ideals that my ancestors fought for. So I don't think we should treat all of these individuals as the same. And I think that it's important for us to look at cancel culture as a tool. It's like a knife. A knife can cut people and hurt people, or a knife can be a convenience. You can use it to cut cake and make it easier for yourself. I look at cancel culture as that in the right hands, it is giving accountability, it is giving free speech. And in the wrong hands, you get the Kanye Wests, you get the Donald Trumps, you get the Kyrie Irvings, you get these types of problematic people.
John, and your closing thoughts, what are they?
Well, I guess I'm just so reluctant, knowing what I do of history and recent history in America, to allow any individual, whether it's someone I know to be a good person like Ernest or you, but we're all flawed, and none of us should be in a position to decide whose intentions are good and whose are bad and who's evil and who isn't, and therefore who can work and who can speak and who can't. And yeah, I'm happy to answer Ernest's question. I think the general first line of defense when people in public view say obnoxious things is you criticize them. Doesn't mean you cancel them. Doesn't mean they lose their job and their ability to work, but it means you say that's wrong. Most of the time, what you do is ignore them because it doesn't really matter what they think. But what you don't do is create a whole society in which people are afraid to speak out on a routine basis. And that's where we're living in. And I think that's where when it's gone too far.
Well, we're approaching the end here. In our program today, we talked about what is the most critical view you want everyone to take away from today's program. Ernest, what are your thoughts?
I think that marginalized people should use all of the abilities that free speech provides them, and cancel culture is one of them. But we protest, we organize, we petition. When I think about the Stonewall riots, people would have called that cancel culture when, Black and brown trans people and their allies and others came to Stonewall and they put up a fight. They spoke out, they had rallies. It was all of those things that got us to that point. When we look at the boycotts and when people want to cancel certain products, like Kohler's beer, or when we look at Anita Nita Bryant, who was a big, huge homophobe, and people, went to events and protested and boycotted her events. That was how we spoke truth to power. And those were great examples that led us to get the victories. It was not pretending that simply sitting down with people that do not necessarily mean well for you is going to be the only way. So I think we have to divorce our notions of respectability politics and tone policing and how marginalized people fight for their rights, because history has shown us that they will use every aspect of free speech, including cancel culture, to get there, and it has worked.
And John, what can we take away from this conversation?
Well, I'd like to wrap up by mentioning a few points of agreement with Ernest, because in many ways we're coming from the same place. We're both members of marginalized communities, and we have both been involved in protesting and fighting and arguing for our rights and the rights of others. And I respect that about you, Ernest, and I'm glad you're here today for that reason. I agree with you about the importance of the right to protest and actually protesting, to criticize, to be vigorous about that. That's what I'm here defending. I don't want people to lose their jobs if they do that. I agree with you very much that we've got to be able to walk and chew gum. Yes, I'm very critical of cancel culture, but there is an immediate threat with legislation coming out predominantly of the conservative movement in America that is stripping books from libraries, telling teachers that they cannot bring up certain subjects in classrooms, and on and on and on. We got to walk and chew gum. We got to fight it from both sides. And finally, I want to say that to me, this conversation we've been having is a model of doing it right. And I think the disagreement that Ernest and I have about where to draw lines between, criticism or peaceful protest versus canceling, that's a long conversation that we're going to need to keep having. And I'm glad to be having it with Ernest here today.
Gentlemen, and to have your perspectives, they truly matter and help us put this into perspective when it comes to cancel culture. There seems to be a divide, and this divide has us understanding, wait, if this is hurting someone else, is it acceptable? Should they be punished or should they be criticized? And so both of you, thank you very much for joining us today. We trust the different perspectives you've heard today will give you more clarity regarding the news on this issue as it passes by us daily. As always, we continue talking about things that matter with people who care, thanks to viewers like you.